Both Marxist and liberal theories of human nature are incoherent. The refutation of the abstract individual liberal is straightforward in that there is no self prior to institutions, and Marxist theory of human nature tries to account for this fact, but in doing so becomes incoherent as well because of a paradoxical category error. To show this, I will first lay out his theory, and then I'm going to show its paradox and category error. Following that, I'm going to explain why it matters, and lastly, I will be forced to conclude that neither liberalism nor Marxism offer a serviceable conception of human nature. Just for now, just for now, just for now. Alright, so Roger Scruton adamantly rejects progressive conceptions of the abstract individual on the grounds that a social contract presupposes the very order that is supposedly formed through it. When criticizing the progressive vision of society, especially when discussing social contract theory, he leans on Hegel's concept of mutual recognition, which suggests that selfhood and order is formed and recognized through institutions. In other words, the self is created by institutions, not the other way around. Now, Marx's theory of human nature also holds a similar ontology. He argues that human consciousness changes with every change in their material existence. For him, human traits such as individuality or freedom are not inherent. They're instead defined by economic conditions of a given time. So Marx criticizes theories of human nature that talk of an abstract individual removed from historical distinctions because an abstract individual as such cannot exist outside of abstraction. Put differently, the self cannot exist on its own. Human nature for Marx, therefore, is not fixed. It is instead a changeable product of material conditions. Yet my own view is that in Marx's theory of human nature lies not only a paradox, but also a category error. If not for the paradox, then the category error might not matter as much, but because of the persistence of the paradox, it matters gravely. And here I will show how these logical errors makes Marx's theory of human nature incoherent altogether. Marx is explicit in his attempts to strip consciousness of its power to shape reality, only to immediately grant that same power to matter. First, as noted earlier, he insists that man's consciousness changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence. For Marx, then, the human being is a passive recipient of reality and thus not a creator of it. His claim that in bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality while the living person is dependent and has no individuality is an example of how he removes the spirit or will from the human and projects it onto the material economy. He furthermore describes modern productive forces as having the agency to revolt against modern conditions of production. For Marx, then, the material world becomes a conscious process that has intentions and individuality. As Roger Scruton explained in his essay on Masaryk, in their attempt to read the whole social world as nothing but a material process, Marx and Engels have been driven to describe the world as though it were really mental. Dialectical materialism understands nature through laws that have their true application only in the world of concepts. Marxism, like every other form of extreme objectivism, is really an illusionism. Its attempt to displace consciousness from the center of our knowledge leads by an inevitable paradox to a description of a material world as itself a kind of conscious process. It's my own view that Roger Scruton is correct in his analysis, and so is Masaryk. And to clarify this point, the paradox here lies in the fact that Marx negates the intellects and reduces them down to mere products of material conditions, right? But in doing so, he suggests that material conditions are intellectually aware or have intentional conscious processes. He is saying that it is not actually human beings that have conscious mental states, but material things such as capital. In other words, he functionally attributes mental states to money. And this is evident in his claim that bourgeois society is like a sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld. Having identified this paradox, we can clearly see the category error. In his personification of the material world, in the case of capital, for example, Marx applies the rules of logic to history. In the world of concepts, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C is inevitable. This conclusion is simply guaranteed by the terms. This ain't the case for science and history, though. In science and history, things are only probable based on observation, not a priori. There is, therefore, a clear distinction between logic, which is the world of concepts, and science and history, which is the world of reality or material, as it were. And Marx claims to be doing science because he's observing reality, but he makes claims that only belong in logic. He claims, for example, the fall of the bourgeoisie and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. By using the word inevitable here, Marx turns history into a syllogism. If the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly developing industry, A, and the development of industry inevitably unites the proletariat, B, then the very existence of the bourgeoisie guarantees its own destruction, C. So A equals B and B equals C, so A equals C is inevitable. If this were mythology, Marx's category error would be fine, but he claims that he's doing science. He claims that he isn't inventing ideas, but rather discovering actual relations. To describe human history as observed is to do science. But in describing how things end, his claims are teleological. And in this way, he made himself not a scientist, but a prophet. His paradox turns his so-called science into a phantasm where he attributed matter to what is the very essence of the mind, an unceasing aspiration toward the best. And this category error also negates political action and makes Marx's prescription incoherent as well. If the material world is a conscious process that is moving toward a specific outcome, and that outcome is inevitable, then human effort is redundant. He wants the proletariat to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, but his theory says that the material forces are already doing this. In other words, it is not humans that want capitalism, it's the material forces themselves. For Marx, then, the material forces are the things in the world with conscious mental states and ideas, not people. The Marxists, therefore, must fight and die to achieve a result so-called laws of nature have already guaranteed. Marx mocked German literature for seeing the French Revolution as the result of laws of pure will rather than real political struggle. Yet by making capital independent and history inevitable, he commits the same mistake. He treats economic laws as if they were laws of pure will. He tries to prove that everything is driven by material conditions, but he does so by attributing to the material world the very spirit and will he tried to eliminate. It is for these reasons that, although the liberal conception of an abstract self that creates society is incoherent, Marx's theory of human nature is also incoherent, and is actually much worse.